There's something about truck stops in the dead of night that draws all kinds of souls, the weary, the wandering, and sometimes the wicked. But among the legends whispered by truckers over steaming cups of coffee, few stories send chills down spines quite like what happened at Grace's Corner, just off Highway 15 in Montana. Specifically, the tale of a quiet chef named Michael "Mike" Harrison, a man whose skillets and knives weren't the only tools he'd mastered with lethal precision. Join me today as we delve into the story that changed how folks think about judging. A book by its cover, and remember, if this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale might just leave you speechless. Grace's Corner wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just another 24-hour beacon of hope for long-haul truckers and late-night travelers. The neon sign buzzed with a persistent hum, casting alternating shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Inside, though, something was different. The coffee wasn't just hot, it was good. The eggs weren't just edible, they were exceptional. And the man behind it all moved through his kitchen with the kind of fluid grace that seemed almost out of place in a truck stop diner. Sheriff Tom Cooper, a veteran of 20 years on the force, often found himself at Grace's Corner during the graveyard shift. "There are two kinds of quiet men in this world," he once wrote in his personal journal, "those who've got nothing worth saying and those who've seen too much to speak of it. Mike Harrison, he was definitely the latter." The regulars at Grace's Corner knew Mike's routine by heart. He'd arrive precisely at 10 p.m., wearing crisp kitchen whites that somehow stayed clean no matter what the night threw at him. His movements were economical, precise. Nothing wasted, nothing flashy. The only distinctive feature was a small Force Recon tattoo on his forearm, mostly hidden by his rolled sleeves, though he never spoke about it when asked. Sarah Martinez, the overnight waitress who'd worked there longest, noticed things others missed. The way Mike's eyes would scan each new customer as they walked in, how he always positioned himself with clear sight lines to both exits, the way his hands moved, with surgical precision, whether he was dicing onions or plating meals. Sometimes, she'd later tell reporters, it felt less like watching a cook and more like watching a dance or maybe a martial art. Dr. James Chen, a regular who stopped by for coffee during his hospital night shifts, was the first to really piece things together. A former military physician, he recognized the signs, the way Mike stood, the unconscious situational awareness, the economy of movement. "I treated enough Force Recon Marines to know one when I see one," he'd later explain. "But what caught my attention wasn't what he was, it was what he was trying not to be." The catalyst for what would become a legend started rolling down Highway 15 on a cold October night. The Sons of Silent Thunder, a notorious motorcycle gang that had been slowly expanding their territory, had chosen Grace's Corner as their next target for their protection racket. Led by a mountain of a man known as Big Rick Richardson, they'd already squeezed protection money from 3 other truck stops along Highway 15. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that Mike Harrison wasn't just another short-order cook. 8 years in Force Recon, 4 of them as a scout sniper with confirmed kills that would never appear in any official record. He'd traded his rifle for spatulas and his scope for a grill, seeking peace in the simple art of feeding people. But as the rumble of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, the night manager, Earl Peterson, couldn't help but notice how Mike's movements in the kitchen suddenly became even more precise, more measured, like a cat tensing before a leap. The bikers were coming, their headlights cutting through the Montana night like angry eyes. And in his kitchen, Mike Harrison kept cooking, his muscles memory remembering other nights, other targets, other dances with violence. The difference was, this time, he wasn't in some far-off desert or mountain range. This time, he was defending his home. The first three bikers rolled into the parking lot at 2:17 a.m., their Harley-Davidsons cutting through the peaceful night like angry hornets. Sarah Martinez watched them through the fingerprinted windows, her hand unconsciously tightening around the coffee pot she'd been about to refill. In the kitchen, Mike continued assembling a Denver omelette, but his movements had shifted subtly, closer to the knife block, angled toward the door. Big Rick Richardson entered first, ducking his 6'4" frame through the doorway, followed by his lieutenants, a lean, scarred man everyone called Switchblade, and a muscular ex-boxer known only as Hammer. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully. Incongruous with the sudden tension that filled the diner, the few truckers present suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. "Evening, folks." Big Rick's voice carried the false warmth of a shark's smile. "It sure smells good in here." He walked to the counter, his heavy boots echoing on the linoleum. Sarah approached, coffee pot trembling slightly. "Just coffee for now, darling. Need to have a little chat with your manager." Earl Peterson emerged. From his office, a thin man with thinning hair and worried eyes. He'd seen what happened to Jerry's place 30 miles up the road when they'd refused the Silent Thunder's protection. The repair bills alone had nearly bankrupted them. "Earl Peterson," he introduced himself, trying to keep his voice steady. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Mike's spatula scraped across the grill with surgical precision, flipping the omelette. His back was turned, but his reflection in the polished steel showed him noting positions, angles, distances, old habits that had kept him alive in places whose names he never spoke about. "Way I see it." Big Rick leaned on the counter, his leather vest creaking. "Highways can be dangerous these days. Lot of bad elements out there. For a reasonable weekly fee, my boys can ensure Grace's Corner stays safe and sound." Dr. Chen, sitting in his usual corner booth, watched the scene unfold over his coffee cup. He'd seen that same calculated stillness in Mike once before, 3 months ago, when a drunk trucker had gotten aggressive with Sarah. The man had found himself on the ground before anyone saw Mike move, his wrist locked in a hold that ended the confrontation without violence. But this was different. 3 trained killers versus 1 chef with a military past. "I appreciate the offer," Earl started, "but we've got a good relationship with the sheriff's department." Switchblade chuckled, a sound like grinding glass. "Sheriff can't be everywhere, friend. Accidents happen, equipment breaks, windows." He ran a finger across the counter. "Shatter." That's when Mike spoke, his voice carrying clearly from the kitchen. "Orders up, Sarah." He placed the perfectly plated omelette on the pass-through window, the steam rising like morning mist. "And gentlemen, kitchen's closing in 10 minutes. Big Rick turned, seeming to really notice Mike for the first time. "That's so, Cook. Might want to reconsider that. We're feeling mighty hungry, and it'd be a shame if this fine establishment couldn't accommodate paying customers." Mike finally turned around, wiping his hands on his apron. His movements were unhurried, precise. Those who knew what to look for might have noticed how he positioned himself, how his eyes marked distances and angles, how his weight shifted ever so slightly onto the balls of his feet. 10 minutes, he repeated softly. "But you don't want what I'd serve you after hours." The threat was so subtle, it took Big Rick a moment to catch it. When he did, his face darkened like a thunderhead. Outside, more motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot, the rest of the Silent Thunder's advance team arriving. Big Rick smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Maybe we'll just have to see about that, won't we, Chef?" He stood up, towering, over the counter. "Boys, I think we just found tomorrow night's entertainment." As the bikers swaggered out, Sarah hurried to Mike's station. "Mike, you don't understand. These men, what they did to Jerry's place." "I understand perfectly, Sarah." Mike's voice was quiet as he began cleaning his station with military precision. "But so should they. Some men choose the path of violence." He paused, and for a moment his eyes held shadows of distant battlefields. I simply became the consequence of their choice. Dawn painted the Montana sky in shades of amber when Sheriff Tom Cooper pulled into Grace's Corners parking lot. The night shift's events had already reached him through the small-town grapevine that seemed to run faster than his police radio. Inside, he found Dr. Chen waiting, the physician's shift at County General finally over. "Heard we had some unwelcome visitors," Cooper said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Mike placed a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. "Black, 2 sugars, same as every morning." The sheriff studied the chef's movements, noting the controlled precision that seemed even more pronounced than usual. "Silent Thunder's advance team," Dr. Chen confirmed quietly. "But that's not what's interesting." He glanced at Mike, who was methodically preparing breakfast orders. "Did you know our chef was Force Recon?" Cooper nodded slowly. "Figured he was something. Way he moves, way he watches things. Running his name through the system only turned up his honorable discharge. Everything else was classified." He paused, stirring his coffee. "What I want to know is why a man with his training is flipping burgers in Montana." Sarah, finishing her overnight shift, joined their quiet conversation. "After they left, Mike made some calls. Don't know to who, but—" She hesitated. "I overheard bits. Something about old unit and contingency plans." In the kitchen, Mike worked with focused intensity. Each movement was measured, each task executed with tactical precision. But now there was something else. A subtle shift in his demeanor that the regulars noticed. The peaceful chef was preparing for war. Earl Peterson emerged from his office, face drawn with worry. "They'll be back tonight, that's their pattern. Show up with the full crew, make an example." His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Maybe we should just pay them. Jerry's place will not happen here." Mike's voice cut through the morning clatter of dishes. He stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands. "Sheriff, I need to know, if things get complicated tonight, where do you stand?" Cooper met his gaze steadily. "Officially, I've got 2 deputies and a responsibility to uphold the law. Unofficially," he smiled grimly, "Silent Thunder's been a cancer in this county. Sometimes cancer needs aggressive treatment." Throughout the day, regular customers noticed subtle changes at Grace's Corner. The blinds in certain windows were adjusted to new angles. Tables were shifted slightly, creating clear lanes through the dining room. Security cameras that had been broken for months suddenly had fresh red lights blinking. Around noon, a weathered Jeep pulled into the lot. The man who stepped out moved with the same careful grace as Mike, military bearing evident in every. The stepman Marcus Doc Rodriguez, former Force Recon combat medic, now worked as a paramedic in Billings. He carried a large duffel bag into the diner. "Heard you might need some backup, Whisper." Doc greeted Mike, using a call sign that made Sarah's ears perk up. They embraced briefly, the brotherhood of shared combat evident in their bearing. "Just like old times?" Mike asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Better," Doc replied, patting his bag. "This time we've got home field advantage." By late afternoon, 2 more vehicles had arrived, a battered pickup truck and a clean black SUV. Their drivers didn't introduce themselves, but they carried themselves with the same martial bearing. They spread through the truck stop and surrounding area, making preparations that only trained eyes would notice. Dr. Chen, stopping by for his pre-shift coffee, watched the quiet activity with growing fascination. "You're not just defending," he observed to Mike. "You're setting up a counter-offensive." Mike continued chopping vegetables, his knife moving with lethal precision. "In Force Recon, we learned that the best defense isn't just about stopping the enemy. It's about making them regret choosing the battlefield." He looked up, and for a moment, the overhead lights caught his eyes in a way that made Dr. Chen shiver. By midnight, the sons of Silent Thunder will learn what that means. Outside, the Montana sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. In town, rumors spread about a large group of bikers gathering at the old quarry. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become part of local legend, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight. The old quarry rumbled with the sound of dozens of motorcycles as the sons of Silent Thunder gathered in force. Big Rick paced in front of his assembled crew, his massive frame casting long shadows in the setting sun. 40 riders had answered his call, each one chosen for their reputation for violence. "Something ain't right about that cook," Switchblade muttered, cleaning his namesake weapon with practiced care. "Way he stood, way he talked, reminded me of guys I met in Huntsville, the dangerous ones." Hammer, adjusting the brass knuckles. "He never went without," nodded in agreement. "Did some asking around town. Nobody knows much about him. Just showed up 8 months ago, kept to himself. But here's the thing, old Jimmy at the gun range says he's seen him there. Guy can put 5 rounds through the same hole at 200 yards. Big Rick absorbed this information, his face darkening like an approaching storm. He'd built his reputation on never backing down, never showing weakness. "Don't matter what he was," he growled. "Tonight's about sending a message. Nobody disrespects." Silent Thunder. Back at Grace's corner, the dinner rush was winding down. Mike worked the grill with his usual precision, but now each movement seemed to carry additional purpose. Doc Rodriguez had set up a makeshift aid station in the storage room, laying out supplies with medical efficiency. 3 clicks out, a quiet voice reported. The speaker, a lean man named Ghost, his real name long forgotten, had been Mike's spotter in another life. Now he sat in a booth, nursing a coffee and monitoring a laptop displaying feeds from hastily installed sensors along the highway. Sarah watched the quiet preparations with growing anxiety. "You should all leave," she told Mike during a lull. "It's not worth dying over a truck stop." Mike continued plating a meal, his movements deliberate. "Some things are worth fighting for, Sarah. Not just the place, but what it represents. People need to know there are still safe harbors in the world." Sheriff Cooper had positioned his 2 deputies strategically, one at the highway junction, one at the county line. He himself sat at the counter, his coffee gone cold. "Last chance to do this official," he offered. "I can have state police here in an hour." "With respect, Sheriff," Mike replied, wiping down his station. "Official channels won't solve this. Some predators only understand one language." As night fell, the regulars began clearing out, word having spread about the impending trouble. But not everyone left. Dr. Chen remained, his hospital shift covered by a colleague. 3 long haul. Truckers, all veterans themselves, quietly repositioned their rigs in the parking lot, creating defensive corridors. Earl Peterson emerged from his office, his face ashen. "Just got word from Jerry's place. Silent Thunder did 30,000 in damage when they made their example. Broke both of Jerry's arms." He swallowed hard. "Mike, maybe we should—" "Earl," Mike interrupted gently, "go home. What happens next isn't something you need to witness." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had made similar decisions before, in darker places. The night manager hesitated, then nodded. As he headed for the door, he paused. "Thank you, Mike. Whatever happens, thank you for trying." Outside, the Montana night had turned pitch black, clouds obscuring the stars. Ghost's laptop chirped softly. Movement on the access road, multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Mike nodded, untying his apron with the same precision he'd once used to clean his rifle. He pulled a small case from beneath the counter, removing a set of night vision goggles, military grade, not the civilian variants. "Doc, triage ready." A quiet affirmative from the storage room. "Ghost, Overwatch set." Another nod. "Sarah, last chance to clear out." The waitress squared her shoulders. "This is my home too, Mike. I'm staying." The first distant rumble of motorcycles reached them, growing louder by the second. Mike moved to the kitchen door, his posture shifting subtly. Gone was the quiet chef. In his place stood a predator, preparing to defend his territory. "Remember," he said softly to his assembled team, "we're not looking for a fight, but if they insist—" His eyes hardened. "We show them why you don't corner a Marine." The roar of motorcycles shattered the night's peace as the sons of silent thunder rolled into Grace's Corner's parking lot. Headlights swept across the diner's windows like searching eyes, casting long shadows through the blinds Mike had strategically adjusted hours earlier. The formation was practiced, 2 columns of riders flanking Big Rick's massive custom Harley. Through his night vision goggles, Ghost watched from his elevated position. 43 tangos, he murmured into his throat mic. Main force parking. In quadrants 3 and 4, spotting designated shooters, at least 6 carrying long guns under their jackets. Sheriff Cooper, still at his post by the counter, noted how the bikers spread out with practiced efficiency. This wasn't their first siege. His hand rested near his service weapon, but he knew drawing it would only escalate things faster. "Last, on chance to call in backup," he offered quietly. Mike's voice came back equally soft. "With respect, Sheriff, backup's already here." He nodded toward the shadows where Doc and the others waited, invisible to untrained eyes. The bell above the door chimed as Big Rick ducked through the entrance, followed by Switchblade and Hammer. The rest of their crew filed in behind them, filling the diner with the smell of leather and cold night air. Sarah, playing her role perfectly, approached with a coffee pot. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get you?" Big Rick's smile was all predator. "Actually, sweetheart, we're here for the chef. Heard he makes a mean last meal." Several of his men chuckled darkly. Mike emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. His movements were unhurried, each step precisely placed. To untrained eyes, he might have appeared casual. To the veterans in the room, he was a cobra uncoiling. "Kitchen's closed," Mike stated flatly. "See, that's not how this works," Big Rick growled, his massive frame tensing. "You're going to learn respect. Then you're going to watch while we explain to Earl why protection money is cheaper than repairs." He cracked his knuckles. "After that, if you're lucky, maybe we let you keep one good hand to cook with." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mike folded the towel with military precision, each movement deliberate. "I'm going to make this simple," his voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "Leave now, don't come back. That's your best option." Switchblade's hand moved toward his jacket. In the same instant, red dots appeared on his chest, and laser sights from positions the bikers hadn't detected. Similar dots decorated Big Rick and 3 other key players Ghost had identified earlier. "That's option 1, Mike continued calmly. "Would you like to hear option 2? The bikers froze, suddenly aware they'd walked into something far more organized than expected. Big Rick's face darkened with rage. "You think some lights scare us? Look around, Chef. You're outnumbered 5-1. "Numbers don't matter much. To a force recon sniper," Dr. Chen spoke up from his corner booth, his voice clinical. "Especially not one with Mike's record. Did you know he once held the unit's distance record? Though I suppose those details are still classified." The revelation rippled through the room. Several of the younger bikers shifted nervously, but Big Rick wasn't ready to back down. "Last chance, Cook. Step out from behind that counter and face me like a man, or we do this the hard way." Mike's eyes met Big Rick's, and for the first time, the biker gang leader saw what others had noticed: the cold calculation of a predator who had stalked far more dangerous prey. "The hard way," Mike replied softly, "ends with most of your crew in Dr. Chen's emergency room. The lucky ones, anyway." The tension in the diner reached a breaking point. Outside, thunder rolled across the Montana sky, nature itself seeming to hold its breath. The next move would determine whether Grace's Corner would see diplomacy or destruction. "Your choice," Mike concluded. "But choose carefully. Some decisions you don't get to take back." Big Rick's hand twitched toward his jacket, and the world exploded into motion. Before anyone could blink, Mike had vaulted the counter with liquid grace, his movement so precise it seemed almost choreographed. In the same instant, the diners. Lights cut out, plunging everything into darkness, except for the dancing red dots of laser sights. "Night vision, boys," Ghost's calm voice crackled through the comm units. 3 tangos moving toward the east exit, 2 reaching for weapons near. The restroom. The darkness erupted in confused shouts and the sound of bodies colliding. Mike moved like a shadow through his own territory, each step calculated long before this moment. A biker reached for his concealed shotgun, only to find himself disarmed and on the ground, his weapon sliding across the floor. Another threw a wild punch at where Mike had been a second before, connecting only with empty air, before precise hands found pressure points that dropped him to his knees. "What the hell?" Hammer's voice carried over the chaos. "Somebody get the damn lights!" But the darkness was Mike's ally now. Doc Rodriguez and his team had positioned themselves strategically throughout the diner, their military training evident in how efficiently they controlled the chaos. The sound of zip ties being deployed mixed with grunts of pain and surprise. Sarah had ducked behind the counter, following the plan they'd rehearsed. Through her night vision goggles, courtesy of Ghost's equipment stash, she watched in amazement as Mike systematically dismantled the gang's hierarchy. His movements were pure economy, each strike calculated to disable rather than destroy. Switchblade lived up to his name, blade flashing in the darkness. But Mike had fought better men in worse conditions. The knife clattered to the floor, followed by its owner's pained gasp as precision strikes found nerve clusters that turned aggression into agony. "South window," Ghost reported calmly. 3 attempting to radio their backup outside. Sheriff Cooper's voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't. My deputies have already detained your lookouts. The only communications getting through are the ones we want." Big Rick's roar of rage echoed through the diner. "Light them up! Burn this place to the ground!" But the gang leader's order met an unexpected response. The bikers who had remained outside found themselves caught in the sudden glare of powerful floodlights, strategically mounted hours earlier. They were now clearly visible to multiple cameras and multiple rifle scopes. "Your outside crew is currently being covered by 4 designated marksmen." Mike's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Former Force Recon snipers get bored in civilian life. Sometimes they show up when old teammates call." The diner lights flickered back on, revealing the new reality. A dozen bikers lay on the floor, efficiently restrained. Others stood frozen, caught in tactically disadvantageous positions. Doc's team had positioned themselves at key points, their military bearing now obvious in their stance and control of the room. Mike stood in the center of it all, not a hair out of place, looking more like he'd just finished a busy dinner service than a tactical operation. Big Rick found himself on his knees, his own knife pressed against his throat. When had he lost it? How had this supposed chef moved so fast? "Now then," Mike's voice was professionally calm, like he was discussing the daily special rather than holding a blade to a man's throat. "Let's talk about Grace's Corner's future. You have 3 options." He applied slightly more pressure to the knife. "Option 1, you and your crew spend the next few years in federal prison. My former teammates' documentation of your various activities makes for interesting reading." "Option 2, he continued, you leave Montana. Permanently. Find new territory. Far from here. Never look back." Big Rick, despite his position, managed to snarl. "And option 3, the knife pressed just enough to draw a single drop of blood. You don't want option 3. Throughout the diner, the remaining conscious members of the Sons of Silent Thunder were beginning to understand just how thoroughly they'd underestimated their target. They hadn't walked into a simple shakedown. They'd wandered into an ambush, orchestrated by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of dealing with more dangerous enemies than them. Thunder rolled across the Montana sky as Big Rick weighed his options, blood trickling from where Mike's blade kissed his throat. The diner had fallen into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional grunt of a restrained biker or the quiet movements of Mike's team securing the scene. "You think this ends here?" Big Rick's voice carried a desperate edge. "Silent Thunder has chapters in 3 states. Word gets out what happened." "Word gets out," Mike interrupted smoothly, "that your entire chapter walked into a trap set by a retired Force Recon Marine. How long do you think you'll maintain control after that? How many rivals are waiting for a sign of weakness?" From his overwatch position, Ghost's voice crackled over the comms. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the highway. Looks like our insurance policy arrived right on schedule." As if on cue, the rumble of approaching engines filled the air. But these weren't motorcycles. 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot, their government plates clearly visible in the floodlights. Men in tactical gear emerged, moving with the unmistakable precision of federal agents. "Remember that documentation I mentioned?" Mike's voice remained professionally detached. "Turns out my old unit keeps in touch with various agencies. They've been quite interested in Silent Thunder's operations across state lines." Sheriff Cooper stepped forward, badge catching the fluorescent light. "ATF has had a file on your gang for months. They just needed someone on the inside to provide concrete evidence." He nodded toward one of the truckers who'd stayed. The man now pulling a badge of his own. "Agent Carson's been documenting everything while driving his route." The federal agents moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, taking custody of the restrained bikers. Their team leader, a sharp-featured woman named Agent Phillips, surveyed the scene with professional appreciation. "Impressive work," she noted, examining the precision of Mike's preparations, "though I question your choice of venue for the takedown." Mike finally released Big Rick into federal custody, wiping his blade before returning it to its concealed sheath. "Some places are worth defending, Agent. Sometimes the right battlefield chooses you." Doc Rodriguez emerged from checking the secured bikers, his medical training ensuring none had sustained serious injuries despite their rapid takedown. "Just like Fallujah," he remarked quietly to Mike. "Clean, precise, no unnecessary damage." Switchblade, being led out in handcuffs, passed close to Mike. "Should have known," he muttered. "Where you moved, where you watched everything. Reminded me of guys I met inside, the ones even the guards feared." "Difference is," Mike replied softly, "they went to prison. I went to war. Learned how to handle worse threats than you." Sarah emerged from behind the counter, still processing the evening's events. The diner, remarkably, had sustained minimal damage. Even the coffee pots were intact, still steaming on their burners. "You planned this," she realized. "From the moment they first walked in, you were setting this up." Mike began straightening chairs with the same precision he'd shown in combat moments before. "In Force Recon, we learned that the best defense is making your enemy walk into your kill zone willingly. They chose the confrontation. I just chose the battlefield." Ghost appeared from his hidden position, laptop tucked under his arm. "Surveillance footage and audio recordings are already uploaded to secure servers. Between that and Agent Carson's evidence, Silent Thunder won't be troubling this or any other truck stop for a long time." Outside, the federal agents were processing the scene. The bikers' motorcycles would be impounded, their weapons catalogued as evidence. Agent Phillips approached Mike again, her expression curious. "You could have handled this differently," she observed. "Called us in from the start. Moved to a new location. Why risk everything defending a truck stop?" Mike glanced around the diner, at Sarah adjusting her apron, at Dr. Chen returning to his usual booth, at the truckers settling back in for their interrupted meals. His eyes held memories of other places, other battles fought far from home. "The Marines. We learned that some things are worth fighting for, not just places, but what they represent. Grace's Corner isn't just a truck stop, it's a haven for people who need one. Sometimes, he smiled slightly, returning to his position. Behind the grill, the most important victories are the ones that keep safe harbors safe. Dawn broke over Grace's Corner like any other day, the rising sun painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. But this morning was different. Federal agents still worked methodically in the parking lot, cataloging evidence and loading. The last of the Silent Thunder members into transport vehicles. The local news vans had started arriving, drawn by police scanner chatter about a major gang takedown. Earl Peterson stood in his office doorway, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The diner itself showed remarkably little evidence of the night's events, a testament to Mike's precise planning and execution. Even now, the chef was back at his grill, preparing breakfast as if orchestrating a tactical operation against a notorious biker gang was just another part of the daily special. "You're taking this awfully well," Sarah observed, bringing Earl a fresh cup of coffee. The night manager's hands had finally stopped shaking. "Probably still in shock," he admitted. "But you know what's strange? I keep thinking about what Jerry said after they broke his arms, about feeling helpless, about losing faith in people." He watched Mike efficiently plate an order. "Maybe sometimes we need reminding that there are still people willing to stand up against the darkness." Agent Phillips had set up a temporary command post in one of the booths, coordinating with other field offices. "Silent Thunder's leadership structure is unraveling," she reported to her superiors. "Word's spreading about what happened here. Their other chapters are either going to ground or turning on each other." Doc Rodriguez, packing up his medical supplies, exchanged knowing looks with Ghost. They'd seen this pattern before, in other places, how striking the head of the snake could cause the whole body to thrash itself apart. "Just like Kandahar," Ghost murmured. "Remember that warlord's network?" "Difference is," Doc replied quietly, "this time we're protecting home ground." Dr. Chen, who had stayed through the entire operation out of both professional duty and fascination, was examining Mike's tactical setup with academic interest. "The way you use the diner's layout," he observed, "turning their assumed advantages into vulnerabilities. It's brilliant." Mike continued working, his movements never losing their precision. "In Force Recon, we learned that familiar terrain is a weapon in itself. Every corner, every sightline, every shadow. They're all tools, if you know how to use them." The truckers who had helped, the real ones, not undercover agents, were sharing their perspectives with local reporters. The story was already growing, spreading across CB radio channels and truck stop networks. A message was being sent, clearer than any warning Silent Thunder had ever delivered. Some safe harbors have teeth. Sheriff Cooper, finishing his incident report, looked up as his deputies reported a curious development. Other businesses in the county, emboldened by the night's events, were coming forward with their own evidence against various criminal enterprises. The fear that had kept people silent was cracking. "Funny thing about bullies," Cooper mused, accepting a fresh coffee from Sarah. "Once somebody stands up to them, their whole power structure starts to crumble." The federal agents were particularly interested in Mike's background, but their inquiries met official roadblocks. His service record remained heavily redacted, his missions classified. Only his former teammates knew the full scope of his capabilities, and they weren't talking. "You know they'll write reports about this," Agent Phillips said, approaching the encounter. "Analysis of tactics, psychological profiles. They'll want to understand how one man turned a truck stop into a trap that brought down an entire criminal organization." Mike flipped a pancake with surgical precision. "Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a knife," he replied. "Sometimes it's letting your enemy think they're in control, right until the moment they realize they've walked into your crosshairs." As the morning rush began filtering in, mixing with law enforcement and media, Grace's corner felt different. The regulars could sense it, a shift in the air, a feeling of security that went deeper than just the absence of threat. They had witnessed something rare, the moment when shadows are pushed back, when good people stand their ground, when justice comes wearing an unexpected uniform. By noon, the parking lot had cleared of federal vehicles, leaving behind only lingering media crews and curious onlookers. But in the darker corners of the criminal underworld, tremors were already spreading. In a smoke-filled bar, 3 states away, a burly man in a leather vest slammed down a phone and turned to his companions. "Silent Thunder's done," he growled. "Feds got RICO charges lined up, chapter presidents turning evidence faster than they can process the paperwork." His knuckles whitened around his beer bottle. All because of some damn cook in Montana. The news traveled through shadowy channels, each retelling adding layers to the legend. Some said the chef was a ghost from Black Ops missions. Others whispered about classified operations that would never see daylight. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere. In between. At Grace's corner, Mike worked his shift with characteristic precision, but subtle changes were evident. More truckers were stopping in, drawn by the story spreading across the highways. They came as much to see the place as to eat, trying to spot evidence of the battle that had played out hours before. "Getting quite a reputation," Ghost observed, lingering over coffee before heading back to his civilian life. "Word spreading fast in certain circles. You might have visitors, old enemies, new challengers." Mike adjusted the flame under a simmering pot with military precision. "Let them come. Some lessons need teaching more than once." Dr. Chen, reviewing security footage from the incident for his own analysis, noted patterns that others might have missed. "The way you moved," he commented. "It wasn't just combat training. You were reading them, anticipating reactions, manipulating psychology." "Force Recon taught us more than just fighting," Mike replied, his knife work on vegetables remaining precise. "Understanding how predators think, how they react when cornered, sometimes that's more valuable than knowing where to strike." Sarah noticed other changes too. Local business owners started dropping by, seeking quiet conversations with Mike. Each one left looking more confident, standing straighter. The shadow of fear that had hung over the community was lifting, replaced by something stronger. Jerry himself made an appearance, his arms still in casts from Silent Thunder's previous message. He sat at the counter, watching Mike work with tearful gratitude. "Heard what you did," he said finally. "Wanted to say, well, just thanks." But not all reactions were positive. Agent Phillips returned late afternoon, her expression grave. "We've got chatter," she informed Mike quietly. "Other organizations watching what happened here. Some see it as an opportunity, others as a challenge. You might have started something bigger than just taking down one gang." "Already started," came a new voice. A weathered man in a trucker's cap approached the counter, revealing a federal marshal's badge. "Silent Thunder's collapse is creating a power vacuum. Already seeing movement from other groups, testing boundaries, looking for weakness." Mike continued his work, but his movements held an added layer of awareness. "They'll come looking," he acknowledged. "Different predators, same hunger, but now they know. Some places bite back." Sheriff Cooper, processing paperwork at his usual spot, added his perspective. "Getting calls from other jurisdictions. Everyone wants to know how one truck stop brought down an entire criminal organization. Had to remind them it wasn't the place, it was the man defending it." Doc Rodriguez, who had decided to stick around just in case, was setting up a more permanent medical cache in the storage room. "Like that village in Helmand," he reminded Mike. "Sometimes holding one piece of ground changes the entire battlefield." As evening approached, Grace's corner settled into a new normal. The regulars returned, mixed with newcomers drawn by the story. But there was a different energy now, an awareness that this wasn't just a truck stop anymore. It had become a symbol, a message to those who prey on the innocent. Mike worked his grill with the same precision he'd used in combat, each movement calculated, each action purposeful. He'd chosen this place as his post-military home, his quiet corner of the world. Now it had become something more, a line in the sand, a statement about standing against darkness. 3 days after Silent Thunder's fall, the first warning signs appeared. A black SUV with Oregon plates circled Grace's corner 4 times before parking across the street. Its occupants, wearing expensive suits that couldn't quite hide their predatory nature, watched the diner with calculated interest. Romani family. Ghost's voice crackled through the encrypted channel he'd left with Mike. West Coast Syndicate. They're moving east, looking to fill the power vacuum. 2 made men, 3 soldiers. Mike acknowledged with a subtle tap on his knife handle, the sound picked up by hidden microphones. He'd been expecting this. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the criminal underworld was no different. The Romani family had a reputation for being more sophisticated than Silent Thunder, more strategic in their approach. "They're smarter than the bikers," Sheriff Cooper observed, nursing his coffee. "Won't make the same mistakes. They'll probe first, look for weaknesses." Dr. Chen, who'd developed an uncanny knack for reading the subtle shifts in Mike's demeanor, noticed the chef's movements becoming even more precise. "You're not worried," he observed. "You expected this." "In Force Recon," Mike replied, his knife, work never faltering. "We learned that taking out one target often draws out others. Sometimes that's part of the plan." Sarah overheard fragments of conversation from the suits when they finally entered the diner. They spoke in careful undertones about territory acquisition and operational consolidation. Their Italian leather shoes and Rolex watches marked them as a different breed of predator than Silent Thunder's brutish enforcers. The leader, who introduced himself only as Mr. Romano, sat at the counter with casual elegance. "Quite an operation you ran," he remarked to Mike. "Very professional. Our organization appreciates professionals." Mike continued cooking, his movements measured. Just a chef protecting his kitchen. "Of course," Romano smiled, all corporate charm and hidden menace. "But perhaps we could discuss mutual opportunities. Our organization offers better benefits than motorcycle gangs. Better protection, more sophisticated operations." From his usual booth, Doc Rodriguez watched the exchange with military attention to detail. The Romani family's reputation preceded them. They preferred boardrooms to violence, but their retribution, when it came, was surgical and absolute. "We're expanding into this territory," Romano continued smoothly. "Change is inevitable. Better to be part of the change than swept away by it. We could use someone with your particular skill set." Mike plated an order with precision that spoke of years of discipline. "Not interested." Romano's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Consider carefully. We're not like Silent Thunder. We don't make messes. We solve problems. Permanently." "That a threat?" Sheriff Cooper asked quietly from his spot at the counter. "Simply business," Romano replied, standing. "Everything's business in the end. We'll give you time to consider our offer. A week should suffice." He placed a business card on the counter. "For when you want to discuss terms." As the suits left, their SUV pulling away with quiet efficiency, Earl Peterson emerged from his office looking pale. "I've heard about the Romani family," he said. "They're connected. Political protection, corporate fronts. Even the feds have trouble touching them. Different predators," Mike acknowledged, his knife making precise cuts through an onion. "Same hunger." Agent Phillips, who'd maintained surveillance on Grace's corner, arrived shortly after. "We've been watching the Romani expansion," she reported. "They're methodical, patient. They'll research everything about this place, about you. They'll find pressure points, vulnerabilities. Let them look, Mike replied calmly. The precision of his movements had taken on an edge that Dr. Chen recognized from the night of Silent Thunder's fall. Some lessons need teaching more than once. As evening settled over Grace's corner, the regulars couldn't help but notice subtle changes again. New faces at strategic tables, truckers who moved with military bearing, civilians whose eyes tracked exits and entrances. Mike's old unit was quietly mobilizing, preparing for a different kind of battle. The week that followed Romano's visit brought subtle changes to Grace's corner. Health inspectors appeared with unprecedented frequency, each finding minor violations that required immediate attention. The local building department suddenly discovered permit irregularities that needed costly reviews. Even the parking lot was cited for violations that hadn't existed the week before. Death by 1,000 cuts, Agent Phillips observed, reviewing the mounting paperwork. This is how the Romani family operates. They strangle businesses legally before ever throwing a punch. Mike worked through it all with characteristic precision, but those who knew him best noticed changes in his routine. He spent more time studying the surrounding terrain, mapping angles and approaches with the same attention he once gave to sniper positions in foreign mountains. Ghost's intel network brought disturbing reports. "They're thorough," he told Mike during a secure call. "Running background checks on everyone connected to Grace's corner. They've even tried accessing your classified records. Sarah discovered her apartment had been broken into, though nothing was taken. Dr. Chen found his hospital privileges temporarily suspended, pending a review of his credentials. Sheriff Cooper faced sudden internal affairs investigations into old cases. Pressure points, Doc Rodriguez noted, helping Mike modify the diner's layout once again. They're isolating the target, weakening support structures, classic psychological warfare. Earl Peterson received a letter from his bank regarding loan irregularities. "They're offering to help," he said, hands shaking as he showed Mike the documentation. "Say they can make all our problems disappear if we sell to their development corporation." The diner's regular customers faced their own mysterious difficulties. Truckers found their routes mysteriously reassigned. Local patrons discovered credit, problems or licensing issues. The message was clear. Association with Grace's corner carried a price. Mike's response was characteristically measured. He made calls to old contacts, arranged meetings in quiet corners. A team of pro bono lawyers appeared, taking on the various legal challenges. Anonymous donations helped cover sudden expenses. The community that had witnessed his stand against Silent Thunder rallied again, differently but just as determined. "You're fighting a different kind of war now," Dr. Chen observed, watching Mike meticulously prepare the next day's ingredients. "This isn't about violence, it's about will." The pressure escalated. Health department shut down Grace's corner for 48 hours. Building inspectors declared the property unsafe. But each attack met unexpected resistance. The lawyers found irregularities in the inspection processes. Anonymous tips to federal agencies raised questions about the timing of these sudden regulatory interests. "Your Marines are something else," Agent Phillips commented, watching the counter-offensive unfold. "I've never seen the Romani family face this kind of organized resistance." Mike worked through it all, each movement still precise, each action purposeful. But now his battlefield wasn't just the diner, it was spreadsheets and legal documents, permits and regulations. He fought with the same tactical precision he'd once applied to combat operations. Late one night, as Mike cleaned his kitchen to military standards, Romano returned. The corporate predator sat at the counter, his expensive suit somehow immaculate. "Despite the late hour? Impressive," he admitted, watching Mike work. "You've adapted well to this form of combat. But you must realize we have endless resources. We can maintain this siege indefinitely." Mike's knife work remained precise as he prepared for the next day's service. "You're asking the wrong question," he replied quietly. "Oh?" Romano raised an eyebrow. And what's the right question? Not how long we can resist, Mike's movements never faltered, but how much it will cost you to force us. Every delay, every legal challenge, every bit of resistance, it all leaves paper trails, patterns that certain agencies find interesting. Romano's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. Are you threatening us? No. Mike's voice carried the same quiet certainty it had when facing down Silent Thunder. I'm giving you the same choice. Walk away, find easier targets, or discover why even your kind of warfare has consequences. As Romano left, his confident stride slightly less smooth, Sarah approached Mike's station. Will they back off? Mike's eyes held the calculated awareness of a man who had fought enemies in many forms. They'll make one more push, he predicted, something decisive. Then we'll see who really understands escalation. The decisive move came at midnight, 3 days after Romano's last visit. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into Grace's Corners parking lot, disgorging men who moved with professional precision. Unlike Silent Thunder's brute force, this was a calculated operation. Teams moved to pre-designated positions, covering all approaches with tactical efficiency. 12 tangos, Ghost's voice crackled through the comm system. Ex-military contractors, they're running a full tactical sweep pattern. Mike watched from his kitchen, noting their movement patterns. These weren't common thugs. Their approach spoke of professional training, possibly former special operations. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who had seen real combat. They've got the building surrounded, Sheriff Cooper reported quietly from his position at the counter. Multiple teams, coordinated movements. This isn't a shakedown. It's a tactical operation. Romano entered last, his expensive suit exchanged for tactical gear that looked barely worn. Final offer, Chef, he called out, his corporate veneer stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. Walk away now. The property's being condemned tomorrow anyway. Save us all some unpleasantness. Mike's response was to continue cooking, his movements maintaining their precise rhythm. But those who knew him recognized subtle changes in his posture, the way his hands moved closer to certain kitchen implements that could serve multiple purposes. You're outnumbered, Romano pressed. These men aren't street thugs. They're professionals like you. They understand the real language of violence. Numbers don't matter much, Mike replied calmly. When you're in someone else's kill box, the dough. First sign that something was wrong came from the tactical team covering the rear exit. Their radio check went unanswered. Then the team watching the roof fell silent. Professional operators started looking nervous, recognizing the signs of a prepared defense. He's not alone, one of the contractors warned, his military experience recognizing the pattern. We've got multiple hostiles, probably with advanced tactical training. Romano's facade cracked further. How many men do you have? Enough. Mike's voice carried through the diner with quiet certainty. Former Force Recon doesn't fight fair. We fight to win. As if to emphasize his point, red dots suddenly appeared on the tactical vests of key operators. Ghost's voice came, through their own radio frequency, proving he'd cracked their encryption. 4 sniper teams have your positions mapped. 2 demolition experts have rigged key points around you. You're standing in a prepared battle space. Dr. Chen, who'd stayed, despite the danger, recognized the shifting power dynamics. These contractors were professionals. They could recognize when a tactical situation had turned against them. One by one, they began backing toward the exits. You can't touch us legally, Romano snarled, his corporate mask completely gone. We have protection in places you can't reach. Maybe. Agent Phillips emerged from the shadows, her badge gleaming. But we've been documenting everything. Your tactical teams just walked into a federal surveillance operation. Every move, every threat, all recorded. Mike's knife work never faltered as he continued preparing the next day's ingredients. You had 2 choices, he said quietly. You chose escalation. Now you get to explain to your bosses how you turned a simple property acquisition into a federal investigation. The tactical teams were already retreating, professional pride overcome by survival instinct. They could sense what Silent Thunder had learned too late. This wasn't just a diner. It was a fortress defended by someone who had turned tactical planning into an art form. Romano's last vestiges of control crumbled as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. "This isn't over," he threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Mike replied, his movement still precise as he cleaned his station. "It is. Because your bosses don't like attention. They don't like patterns that federal agencies can track, and after tonight they'll have both." As the SUVs peeled out of the parking lot, Doc Rodriguez emerged from his concealed position. "Just like Damascus," he remarked. "Let them think they have tactical superiority until it's too late to realize they're surrounded." In the days following the Romani family's retreat, changes rippled through the criminal underworld. Word spread quickly, not just about another failed attempt to take Grace's corner, but about the sophistication of its defense. The story evolved from a simple tale of a tough chef into something more complex, a legend about a fortress that adapted to any threat. Agent Phillips, reviewing surveillance footage with her superiors, noted patterns emerging. 3 different organizations tested this location, she reported. Each one failed differently. Silent Thunder through direct confrontation, the Romani through sophisticated tactics. The message is spreading. This place is untouchable. Mike worked through it all, maintaining his precise routine, but those closest to him noticed subtle changes. The military bearing remained, but something else had settled into place. A sense of permanence, of roots growing deeper. "You knew this would happen," Dr. Chen observed one quiet afternoon. "From the first moment Silent Thunder walked in, you were setting precedents, creating a reputation." Mike's knife work remained steady as he prepared the evening service. "In Force Recon, we learned that sometimes the best victory isn't the battle you win, but the battles you prevent. Every failed attempt becomes a warning to others." The effects spread beyond Grace's corner. Other businesses in the region reported criminal organizations backing off, reconsidering their territories. The power vacuum left by Silent Thunder's collapse began filling with legitimate enterprises instead of rival gangs. "Like dropping a stone in still water," Sheriff Cooper mused, watching the changes ripple through his jurisdiction. "The waves keep spreading." Sarah, who had watched the entire transformation from the beginning, found herself receiving visits from other waitresses, other small business workers. They came seeking advice, hoping to understand how one truck stop had stood against forces that had terrorized communities for years. Ghost's surveillance network brought reports of conversations in shadowy places. Criminal enterprises were redrawing their maps, marking certain territories as too costly to pursue. Grace's corner had become more than a location. It was a symbol of resistance. "Different kind of defensive position," Doc Rodriguez noted, sharing coffee with Mike after hours. "Not just protecting a piece of ground anymore, you're defending an idea." Earl Peterson, reviewing his books, discovered something unexpected. Business was booming. Word had spread along the trucking routes. Grace's corner wasn't just safe, it was a beacon. People went out of their way to stop there, to see the place where predators were turned back. "Never thought serving coffee could change things like this," Earl admitted to Mike. "Make people believe they can stand up, fight back." Mike's response was characteristically measured. People always had the power to resist. Sometimes they just need to be reminded. The legal challenges disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. Building inspectors found their paperwork suddenly in order. Health department violations vanished from official records. The Romani family's corporate tentacles withdrew silently, leaving no trace of their attempted takeover. Agent Phillips, preparing to wrap up her official surveillance, shared one last piece of intelligence. Intercepted some interesting communications, she told Mike. Other organizations discussing Grace's Corner. They're not seeing it as a target anymore. They're seeing it as a boundary marker. This far, no further. Late one night, as Mike cleaned his kitchen to military standards, Dr. Chen raised a question that had been bothering him. You could have gone anywhere after leaving the service. Could have used your skills for private contracts, made fortunes in security consulting. Why choose this? Mike's cleaning rhythm never faltered, but his answer carried the weight of carefully considered truth. In the Marines, we protected something bigger than ourselves, ideals, principles, ways of life. Leaving the service doesn't end that mission. It just changes the battlefield. Outside, the neon sign of Grace's Corner continued its steady glow, a beacon in the Montana night. Truckers passing by shared stories on their radios about the place, the food, the coffee, the quiet chef whose skills went far beyond the kitchen. But more than that, they talked about what it represented, proof that sometimes, when good people stand their ground, even the darkest predators learn to walk away. 6 months after the Romani family's retreat, Grace's Corner had transformed. The parking lot was freshly paved, the building renovated, but the changes went deeper than mere appearances. The diner had become a legend in trucking circles, a place where the coffee was hot, the food was exceptional, and the sense of security was absolute. Ghost, making one of his periodic check-ins, brought news from his intelligence network. Interesting pattern developing, he told Mike during a quiet afternoon shift. Other truck stops, diners, small businesses, they're starting to adapt your methods. Not the tactical stuff, but the principle. Communities organizing, standing together. Mike worked his grill with the same precision that had once made him a legend in force recon. Sometimes people just need to see it's possible, he replied. Rest takes care of itself. The regulars had noticed how the diner's influence spread. Jerry's place, once nearly broken by silent thunder, was thriving again. Other businesses along Highway 15 reported similar revivals. The shadow of fear that had hung over the region had lifted, replaced by something stronger, like dominoes falling in reverse, Dr. Chen observed, sharing his usual evening coffee with Mike. Each success story strengthens the next. The predators are learning that some territories cost too much to take. Sarah, now training new waitstaff to handle the increased business, had developed her own keen eye for trouble. She could spot potential problems before they developed, guide situations away from conflict with the same subtle skill she'd learned from watching Mike. You've built more than just a safe haven, Agent Phillips noted during her final official visit. You've created a template. Other communities are studying what happened here, learning how to protect their own. Earl Peterson, reviewing plans to expand the truck stop services, smiled at the irony. They came to shut us down, he told Mike, ended up making us stronger than ever. Sheriff Cooper had seen his own job change. Other law enforcement agencies sought his advice, wanting to understand how one small jurisdiction had turned the tide against organized crime. Funny thing about bullies, he explained to them. Once you show them they can't win, they stop coming back. Doc Rodriguez, who'd decided to open a small clinic next door to Grace's Corner, understood the deeper significance. In Force Recon, we learned that holding ground isn't just about firepower. It's about making a position so strong that enemies choose not to test it. The diner's reputation took on almost mythical proportions in certain circles. Truckers spoke of the chef whose skills weren't limited to cooking, of the quiet professional who had turned a simple truck stop into an impregnable fortress. Each telling added layers to the legend, but the core truth remained the same. One man had chosen to make a stand, and that stand had changed everything. Late one night, as Mike prepared to close, a young couple entered the diner. The man moved with military bearing, his eyes carrying shadows of recent combat. Mike recognized the look. Another warrior trying to find his place in the civilian world. Heard stories about this place all the way in Afghanistan, the young veteran said. About a force recon marine who found a different way to serve. Thought maybe, he hesitated, maybe you could use some help in the kitchen. Mike studied him with the same tactical awareness that had served him in combat and civilian life. He saw not just another soldier, but a chance to pass on what he'd learned about finding peace without surrendering strength. Start tomorrow, Mike replied, recognizing in the young man's eyes the same search for purpose he'd once known. First lessons about more than cooking. Outside, the neon sign of Grace's Corner continued its steady glow, a beacon in the Montana night. But now it stood for something larger, a reminder that some battles are won not through force of arms, but through the quiet strength of those who choose to stand their ground, who transform simple places into symbols of resistance, and who prove that sometimes the most effective warriors are the ones who find ways to serve peace without surrendering their ability to defend it.